You might have been burning some midnight oil to complete your essay yesterday. So thank you for getting that in. My goal is to grade and return that to you by next Monday, along with some general observations and things too. I will also have your latest Canvas prompt from last week, along with all of the attendance stuff updated by Wednesday. So thank you as we're continuing to work through everything in the class, and I'm excited to get into some of the new stuff for this week. So a couple of you mentioned as you were coming in that you have registered. How many folks still need to register for the winter? Okay. So I definitely recommend getting in touch with your advisor to register for winter courses. You can now register for the winter term. So that's open, and I definitely recommend starting to get that all filled in, especially since many of you are in your junior or senior year, just to make sure you've got all your ducks in a row getting ready for graduation. Just to let you know, this winter I'm teaching 2 sections of small group communication and 1 section of public speaking, and then I'm teaching health and science and communication theory in the spring. So we've got a number of face-to-face and online courses in COM if you're a COM major or minor or going that direction. Otherwise, best of luck with registering and getting all slotted for the next term. So last class, we spent some time talking about the ways in which social movements effectively are able to persuade and bring in outside audiences, right? And we looked at this both in the context of the ACT UP for Our piece that was looking at the combination of insider and outsider strategies, and the piece that was looking at anti-nuclear movements and animal rights movements and the ways that they use communication as well to reach audiences. And I think one important takeaway from this, as we're thinking about what makes good social change communication happen and how organizations can effectively advocate for change, is this idea of context and about oscillation. We can think about a group like ACT UP that was very outspoken, very loud in some of its practices, but also was sitting in congressional hearings and using some of the structure and constraints of those hearings as a means for advocacy too, right? And oftentimes, social movements are not just about using one strategy, but about considering context. I mentioned the pitchfork approach last week that suggests, like prongs on a pitchfork, that movements use a variety of forms of activism to achieve a lot of their key goals and ideas. So we looked into that. For this week, what we're going to be looking at is internal elements of social movement communication. By this, I mean, what does it mean for a social movement to communicate within itself, like within members of the organization, right? So if you find yourself a part of an advocacy group or nonprofit or some group that is focused on advocacy on issues you care about, right? What makes for effective communication within that group? What makes for effective connection between members of that group? How do people within that group communicate and work together? As people brought up a few weeks ago, sometimes we find ourselves within movements and groups, and we find that we're not included or involved or respected as a part of that process. Right? That there can be factors such as gatekeeping, or there can be issues such as racism and sexism that exist within movements that can tarnish their ability to achieve their goals and really work holistically with people. So today we're going to be focusing on the Lake piece, which I think is an excellent article that gets into the roles of Indigenous protests and activism, focused specifically on the associated Red Power movements of the 1970s and 80s in the United States. And I think it's not only useful for us topically to look at Indigenous forms of activism, which in many ways challenge what we might consider to be traditional forms of social movements, but I think it's also important for us to think about how these movements work in terms of goals. Because oftentimes, social movement is not necessarily meant for us. We are not necessarily the target audience. And thinking about the idea of a movement being effective means that we think about how it's able to achieve the goals that it's set out for itself. And sometimes if we graft onto the movement what we think the goal should be, right, we're not really looking at what that movement is fully doing. So we'll be spending some good time today looking at this lake piece and specifically how Red Power and associated Indigenous rights movements were able to move outside of traditional boundaries of what we would consider to be success. And then on Wednesday, we will be working through a piece from Dr. Carmen Chavez about counter-public enclaves and about how an enclave, right, a specific enclosed community, is able to work together to achieve social change as well. Incidentally, I was a part, when I was in grad school, I was in a doctoral seminar, and we had this thing where we were working in partnerships, and in our partnerships, we were kind of sharing and progressing on our dissertation work. And the person I was paired with was actually one of Dr. Chavez's advisees, and really cool. She had a really cool article about how we can understand the rhetoric of toxic waste and waste dumping in the Middle East. That was really cool. But anyway, what I do want us to do before we get into that is to just take some time for reflection. So I'm not going to be asking you to turn this in, but I do want you to think about, first of all, some of the things that went well over the process of writing the social movement analysis essay, some of the things that you might have learned through analyzing the way that this movement communicated. And this will be especially helpful as we start to look forward a bit, thinking about how you might apply some skills in social movement communication through your own study and work in this class to a movement that you're interested in. Since the last thing that we'll be working on this term is a presentation where you'll get to share a movement that you have developed or are thinking about developing. So I want to give you a chance to start to brainstorm and think about this too. And there's some further opportunities to brainstorm and start to think about the stage in this week's Canvas prompt as well. You a couple more minutes here. So I'm going to be, by Wednesday's class, posting the full rubric and information for you related to the Create a Movement presentation. But I do just want to remind you about this assignment so that you can start to think about this, since it'll be the last major assignment by the end of the term. So the Create a Movement presentation is something that I'm asking you to do basically in the last couple weeks of the term. And what I'm going to be asking you to do is developing your own example of a movement that's focused on an issue that you're really interested in or you find to be particularly important, right? That doesn't mean that you have to go out and like march or create signs or actively do the thing, but to create and design movement that you might go out and use in the world, right? So what I'm going to be asking you to do is to use a short presentation in class on either December 5th or December 7th. That was the original plan, though I'll mention a little bit more about that in a minute. And basically be using that time to talk about the movement and share with us what it is that you've developed. And then by the 14th, so by the end of the term, in lieu of a final exam, I'll be asking you to do a write-up where you talk about the design of this movement that you've created and the ways that it connects to elements of communication and social change that we've been talking about in class. So I'll post that full rubric and guidelines, but the two main things that I'll be looking at will be both the in-class presentation as well as the write-up that you'll be turning in at the end of the term. So with that being said, I want to point out the schedule and just some things to know. So we're going to continue to work through this week. Next week, we'll be talking about strategies that constrain and hurt social change. We'll be taking time off for the Thanksgiving break. We'll have kind of our last week of new content under week 9. So I've been in touch with Oregon Rural Action about them meeting and presenting about what they do, and I think it's still a really good idea to have that happen. However, they have some really limited availability in November, and they've asked if we can have them present in December instead. which is possible in our schedule, but is going to require us to do a little bit of moving things around. And so I did want to check in with you all to see what might make the most sense or work the best for you and for your schedule. Present some options and hopefully give us the chance to decide on what we would like to do. So basically, ORA would be available during the month of December and would be pretty flexible for either the Monday or Wednesday. We have 2 more class meetings in December, and those were originally scheduled for days in which people would share their presentations. So we've got a few different options here on what we could do. So the first option would be if essentially we had, we kind of contained what we needed to, and I would cut out one of the readings for Monday. We could use Wednesday the 30th as one of the presentation days. We could use the second presentation day as Monday the 5th. And then on the 7th, we could have ORA share just kind of at the end of the term. That is one option we could do. Another option is just slightly different, where we have the 30th for presentations, we have ORA on the 5th, and then we have our final presentations on the 7th. That could work as well. The third option would be if we had ORA present on the 5th of December and we had all of our presentations scheduled for Wednesday, the 7th of December. Essentially, that would be pretty tight, but doable in terms of time, right? We have 15 people in the class. I'm asking each presentation to be about 5 minutes. That would be 75 minutes. And we have about 100, 110 or so minutes in the class. So that would be possible if we compress the presentations to just one meeting. The other option, I think probably the least exciting one, would be if we used either our final exam time, which we do not have scheduled for a meeting, for either the presentations or the ORA sharing some of their stuff. So I did want to kind of put that out there. I think one advantage to having the multiple days is that we're not all kind of cramming the presentations at once. And if people have some limited availability, right, they can choose to present on the other day if they are able to make one of the 2 slots. But I also want to be cognizant of your needs if I'm making some different due dates on presentations for people. So let's maybe get the easy part out of the way. Is there anybody who wants to use the final exam time for us to either have presentations shared or to hear from ORA? Didn't think so. Cool. All right. Cool. So I think what I will do is I will just like post like an anonymous poll, and I'll ask you to indicate your preference. Another option I could do is just have is like look at those dates and have you all present on the 5th and ORA on the 7th. In any case, I just want to respect your schedule and availability and hopefully get them slotted in as well. So what I'll do then is just give you a Google form and just ask you to indicate your preference there. All right. So thanks for that. Again, would want to make sure we can get your presentations in and also have the chance to hear from you. So just wanted to give you that. All right. So let's go ahead and get started talking about this week, and in particular, talking about the Lake reading and what I think that this brings to the table in our overall discussion about social change and communication, right? And I think one of the easiest ways that we can frame this and start to think about this is to think about like the origin of rhetoric and of the history of rhetoric. When we think about rhetoric, right, we think about the idea of using communication and using words to change minds and persuade and convince people to say things, do things, believe things, and ultimately alter their outlook. And if we follow the history of rhetoric and social movements, we oftentimes will think, well, did it do that? Did it persuade or convince an audience? And looking at the words and strategy and communication was something that you did for your project as well. But what I think that this reading does is really kind of throws a wrench into that entire process, and specifically about the idea that it's not necessarily about our use of words to persuade or convince one another. Sometimes the goal is internal, right? And is designed to shore up and support the needs of members of the group rather than convince people on the outside. So what's analyzed in this Lake piece is the idea of were known as red power movements, right? So you might be familiar with Black Power, right? And with the associated movements and activism of the Black Power movement. And red power kind of emerged as a tongue-in-cheek response, right? The usage of the color red, of course, has been done in a very offensive and pejoratory way toward Indigenous communities, but many members of Indigenous communities kind of use that in a reclaiming fashion to kind of talk about methods of advocacy that play off of and almost critique or make fun of the ways in which Indigenous populations have been characterized and treated as as violent or as savage, right? Pushing back against that stereotype is part of what the movement is focused on. And this idea of a militant Indigenous communication strategy, right, is one that is uncompromising, is very clear, has specific demands, needs, and goals, right, and is not hesitating in trying to reach those goals. So in particular, this reading is focused on 1968 to 74 in particular, and about how the Red Power movement during this period of time was able to enact and work toward change. So there are a number of examples here of forms of Indigenous activism. So we can think about, for instance, the American Indian Movement, or AIM. There are examples such as Wounded Knee, the Trail of Self-Determination, The Longest Walk, and a number of activists and advocates, including Dennis Banks and Russell Means, who have played really major roles in the history of Indigenous rights and how Indigenous movements have worked to enact change by utilizing some unique and specific styles of communication. So what I want us to do is to take some time in groups, and this will be part one of your attendance for today, to explore some of the examples of Indigenous social movement communication that have happened both historically, and you might also look to contemporary examples of Indigenous activism that does not need to be based in this geographic area, right? You can look at this worldwide as well. And what I'd like your group to do is, as you're doing some research and taking note of some of these forms of communication, what do you notice about how these movements are communicating, working towards social change, and engaging with populations? What's going on here? What is happening and being done by some of these movements? So what I'll do is give you some time in groups to talk through, do a bit of research on some of these movements, and share some of the things that you're noticing about some of these forms of communication. So let's do a group of 5 on this side and a group of 6 on this side. Take some time to chat and share some of the things you're noticing. We'll talk about it together. Those are examples of ones that you can look at. You don't need to examine everything, but you might start to notice some general trends or examples that stand out to you.
But I guess when should the so maybe I just started.
Give you about 5 more minutes. something like groups are about done. All right. So let's take some time to chat about this and some of the things that you all talked about here, including some examples or situations in which noticed Indigenous activism or movements occurring. So let's start here on this side. What were some examples or ways that you all saw some of these movements communicate?
So we looked at really different movements, and the first one was within the identification change.
Mhm.
And we looked directly into the red light provincial intersections, which is the student embodiment of image.
Mhm.
In first stage, there were narratives to draw upon human emotions. For embodiment, the red hand symbol symbolized a number of different things.
Mhm.
Symbolized the Native Americans who were not there to speak on behalf and some other ones. And then there was the red dress as the images. And then when we talked about the Trail of Self-Determination in 1976, this was a protest held to demonstrate demonstrations in the month of July that demanded to meet the president, the sound of the beating drum. As we moved on, we felt that the longest walk, this was a path to bring awareness to the forceful removal of Native Americans from their homes. It was both spiritually and political. It included rallies, marches, and ceremonies, and the 3,200-mile walk to the life of the resettlement of the Native American Indigenous people.
Yeah. So as you might have noticed, the red dresses are around campus now. I also got an email this morning about the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Project, kind of doing some initiatives this month, including down at UU. So it's definitely something that's actively happening and an example of some of the ways in which the harm, the impacts on Indigenous communities are definitely felt and understood over a long period of time. Right, Trail of Self-Determination. This example of using a very kind of confrontational style, right? Really trying to bring it straight to a president and get their attention is one way in which demonstrations and movements happen. The longest walk is an example of some of the ways in which history, culture, and situation become incredibly important and really a centerpiece of a lot of forms of Indigenous activism and social change, right? Is making us aware of, cognizant of, and also engaging in history as part of the movement. How about here on this side? What were some things that you all were able to uncover?
We have a lot of things sought.
Mhm.
But mainly their forms of communication is a lot of protests and civil disobedience.
Mhm.
So for the Canadian, they have a lot of large protests, and the most famous one is Occupy for 71 days.
Mhm.
And then the longest walk was a large protest march. It played the bass, pipe, and drums, speeches, or the spiritual and political. Trails of self-determination, marches around the White House, played drums, pile chairs, barricades, and then Occupy.
Yeah. So I think one thing that's kind of emerging in a lot of the examples you all have, right, is that we've talked about space and place. We've talked about the role that location and the history of that location plays. And for a lot of Indigenous communities, right, when it is land and it is home that, you know, was taken forcibly, that the arguments that are made about place, about occupation of place, about ownership of place, bring in a very specific and unique weight to them, right? That saying that, you know, this was our land is part of the rhetorical strategy and method that many of these forms of protest and communication do that simply are not the same or not accessible to other movements. So I think that that's an important thing for us to add in here, right? This importance of the role of land and what land means. Because not only, right, is the place physically in which connection, economy, home and community develop, but it's also carrying a connotation of spiritual, religious, and personal significance. And so I think that the role of land in much of Indigenous activism and protest is an important element for us to situate into that broader context too. I wanted to share a few examples here that get into some of the components of this in a little bit more detail. So a couple examples here of some of the Indigenous rights movements and some of the ways that they engage in activism in particular. This was the Wounded Knee of '73, and I think helps us to understand AIM, right, the American Indian movement in broader terms and some of the strategies that are used, and we can see in a bit more of a visual capacity.
Wounded Knee, 1973. Creek War. The 1960s were a troubled time in U.S. history. The war in Vietnam and the civil rights movement marked the decade, along with great music. In the midst of all the social happenings, the American Indian movement originated in 1968, arising from the concerns of Native Americans in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Shortly, the AIM. The movement focused on changing the life of Native Americans in the urban environment, addressing poverty, lack of political representation, discrimination, and police brutality. Members coordinated a neighborhood patrol to circumvent unjust arrests and police mishandling of Native residents. Clyde Bellecourt and Dennis Banks, Chippewa, Minnesota, assisted in the creation of AIM. Later, Russell Means, an Oglala Sioux, became one of the more aggressive leaders of the organization. The AIM members sponsored the Trail of Broken Trees in 1972. Approximately 900 people traveling from Seattle and San Francisco stopped at reservations throughout the West to point out Native grievances toward the U.S. government. The trail ended in Washington, D.C. with a takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs building from November 2nd through November 8th, 1972. Negotiations between the White House administrators and AIM members resulted in an agreement that included a pledge to deal with economic, social, and educational injustice of Native Americans and to provide return travel. Following the death of Raymond Yellow Thunder.
So I think this gives some added context into the history of AIM, right, and broader discussions about Indigenous rights. Again, in thinking about this in terms of reservations, the quality of life on reservations, and the urban and additional concerns that Indigenous populations faced, I think this helps us to understand where much of the attention was missing. We think about, in a similar vein, right, the Young Lords and their activism. It was about highlighting and identifying and bringing political attention to a topic that just was not receiving any sort of feedback or attention from world leaders.
See you later. Once we meet up here, we went to the Dennis Banks. First one, I put my hair long and instead of soil. Now I have one cutting here. My name is Don Wayland. I'm the founder before this forum. I'm founder and national director of the American Indian Movement. I'm from the Anishinaabe Nation in northern Minnesota. 1968, I was 32 years old. I was here in Minneapolis and we were canvassing all the Indian people that we know. There was no Indian centers, no program that we could get. So we go knock on the door and we would tell them who we were. We were trying to start this new organization that we needed their help. So we listened to the issues dealing with housing, health, welfare, police brutality. We promised that people were going to do something about that, but we need your help. Friday on July 28th, 1968, no place to meet. We met an elder who let us use upstairs the whole meeting. Three elders and women, they grabbed me by the skirt and pulled me over the side. and said, we have a name. I said, what is it? And she said, AIM. I said, what does that mean? She said, well, you're aiming to do something about college, you're aiming to do something about our lost children, you're aiming to do something about police brutality and high school dropout rate. And that's why we want to do this and AIM, our voice.
So one thing that I think is useful from this interview clip and thinking more broadly about some of the Indigenous rights movements at this time is the idea that despite the presence of reservations, of spaces, of cultural practices and senses of community, a lot of Indigenous groups reported this feeling of not necessarily being as connected and understanding of the issues and topics that were impacting one another. And so a lot of the early strategies such as canvassing and trying to understand the needs and concerns, and in many ways, kind of generating an agenda and set of issues that were commonly felt. Those were things that were happening over time through the collaboration and work that members of leadership in groups like AIM were doing. So I think that this helps us to contextualize some of the ways in which Indigenous activism was brought in and members of these movements were able to work toward a lot of these methods of change. So I think this is useful in setting up some of the things that are happening within this movement. So when we think about social movements, right, and when we think about communicating for change, our common assumption is that we, right, are the target audience, or the target audience is necessarily people who occupy positions of power, right? So one of the criticisms that is made in this piece about how we think about rhetoric is that movements are not necessarily about trying to change white attitudes on topics, right? That if you're looking at an Indigenous movement and Indigenous forms of activism and saying, did this convince a white person? Well, that's not necessarily what the goal was about. And so thinking about that in a different context in terms of what a movement might be meant to do, what strategies it's using, and so on, is occupying a more internal structure and set of goals, I think is a really useful way for us to think about why movements behave the way that they do, right? One example that we can think about in a very contemporary way is to think about a lot of the rhetoric surrounding politics, right, in the context of election years, right? So we've got the midterm election tomorrow. Many of you might have sent out your ballots already, right? Oftentimes, the messages, the canvassing, the advertisements we get are not necessarily about getting us to change our beliefs, but instead are about reinforcing or encouraging us to adopt the beliefs that we already have. And oftentimes movements do the same. They are reinforcing or instilling or developing a sense of community among groups who already have a shared set of experiences or beliefs, and in many ways are trying to create a shared experience or set of concerns among that community. In this way, if we think about an idea of diaspora, right, about communities that have been geologically scattered, separated, and in many ways decimated, right, over time, one of the important goals of a lot of leaders of these Indigenous movements was about restoring religious beliefs and ways of life that have been lost or have been much more difficult to pass along generationally. In fact, many of the Indigenous tribes in our region, including the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla Indigenous groups, have done a number of language initiatives that are designed to educate future generations and teach them native languages as a way of continuing values and beliefs. There is, in many ways, a concern that the practices, the beliefs, and performances of culture are things that over time will be lost if the identities of tribes and groups doesn't remain strong. So in this way, many Indigenous groups find themselves in positions of wanting and needing to reinforce and support the sense of community, cultures, practices, and traditions that at times are on the brink of being lost. So if we think about the failure then of Indigenous rhetoric, well, it's not a failure because it's not necessarily being judged on the basis of convincing a US president as much as it is about creating a sense of community and camaraderie and shared goals and issues among like members of the group. And this gets at the idea of confirmatory rhetoric, which is entitled this piece, and I think is a useful strategy, right? The idea here is that this rhetoric is achieving its goals through the process of communication. If somebody is speaking and addressing and holding a rally, right, the goal is not necessarily to convince somebody over there, but by the process of you being at this event and working together among members of the group, the movement has fulfilled its purpose, right? And it might motivate things like change or reform, and it might involve other methods of engagement, but its main goal is being achieved through the engagement of activism happening. I think it's also useful to put into context some of these specific demands that are being made by many forms of Indigenous activism, right? One of them is this idea of restoration of land, which is important to a lot of Indigenous groups. Historically, one of the ways that the US government has attempted to provide support has been through a monetary settlement, but a lot of Indigenous communities have rejected this because the ability to have land and use land is much more important toward economic factors, spiritual factors, and other factors of identity, right? Establishing private governments in spaces, again, that can operate autonomously, and abolishing the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which in many cases has been seen as insolvent or ineffective at addressing Indigenous issues, has also been a part of the demands of many of these groups as well. So I think all things that are important to frame the context and strategies that are used here. Let's take a pause and do a short break. I, on the front page of Canvas, have added in a Google form for you in order to indicate your preference for the scheduling at the end of the term. So take some time to get a drink of water, use the restroom and so on. And then if you have a device with you, take a moment to indicate your preference of those options here for the end of the term.
They're gonna be gone, all those students, most likely.
Nationals, most likely.
Yeah, nationals.
So the 30th, the 5th, and the 7th.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's it, we're going all the way. which would be
Okay, which, yes, that would be really exciting.
Yeah.
Okay,
So could we do it like either before, or could we do like a Zoom presentation during the class?
yeah.
How would you-
I'm gonna continue to see where other people are at on that, and then we will make sure to find a way that we can get you both included in that. And it might mean it's either that Monday or it's something that we do remote or something that we do recorded. Yeah, I'll just try to figure out where other people are at, and then we'll kind of try to arrange all those pieces. So I
Okay,
appreciate
cool.
you letting me know. So it would be unavailable on Wednesday, the 30th, but you would be available on Monday, the 28th, right?
No, I think we leave by out.
Okay, so you would be gone 28th, the 30th, the 5th, and the 7th.
Yeah.
Okay.
Most likely.
Okay,
Okay.
cool. All right, thank you for letting me know. I will. I think I can work on it.
Oh my God. Oh my God. I gave you one. Really, oh my God. That's me. Thank you. I have all the.
So I will encourage you to send along your preference by Wednesday's class. And if you know that there are multiple days that you can't make, we'll talk a little bit about how we can still get that schedule working. So thank you for letting me know and indicating your availability there. And appreciate you doing so soon if you haven't done so already. All right. So let's go ahead and continue our discussion here, getting into some of the elements of Indigenous communication and activism. Again, we've talked a little bit about some of the demands and goals that many of these movements might have. So I think that it's useful for us to look at some of the ways in which critique of language and about how oftentimes textual and historical language is being used might be useful for this strategy as well, right? One of the key ideas here is that for many Indigenous movements and religious beliefs and values, that there's not only a desire for self-determination, but elements of spirituality and perspective, according to the late reading, play a really big role here, right? That the experience of existing as a member of culture and of society is something that can't necessarily be captured as easily through words, right? That there's a comparison given in the reading where groups are talking about how while many movements might say that we are talking to a leader, there's an emphasis on experience as a really shaping force in how culture is developed. And what I think that that means for us as we're studying and thinking about how movements communicate is that the focus on words that are spoken and written, as well as accounts of history, I think are really important things for us to consider, right? If you have ever taken a history class, worked in with anybody in the history department, right? They will almost certainly tell you that history is not neutral, right? History is shaped by culture. History is shaped by individuals in power, right? You might be familiar with the phrase history is written by the victors. And in many cases, accounts of history have been ones that are oftentimes mischaracterized or inaccurate to the experiences of indigenous groups, right? For instance, if we think about the history of the Oregon Trail, think about Sacagawea, right? And think about the ways that she's framed or portrayed within that history. There is, in many ways, a lot of very whitewashing narratives about indigenous history, culture, and context that don't necessarily get at the complexities of her as a historical figure, but also more broadly, indigenous experience, right? There are textbooks and accounts and stories that make it seem as if countries very kindly negotiated and led to changes in land that in many ways erase bloodshed and violence against indigenous populations. What that adds then is a skepticism toward how we use words to make sense of and shape history, right? In this way, if we predicate the truthfulness on the spoken word, this is an idea talked about as well in postmodern theory of logocentrism. We're constantly valuing spoken and written history and word. What that ignores is the ways in which other methods of sharing history and lived experience might be practiced. For instance, the usage of oral history, of storytelling, and conveying experiences verbally is common practice in a lot of indigenous tribes and groups that pushes back against the preoccupation with the written word. And in this way, many elements of the Red Power movement emphasize that it's not about language or humans, that they're the primary agents of change, but instead the role of power as a mediated instrument. This idea that the experience of and feeling of power through community and through involvement is offering a unique way of indigenous communities relating to, experiencing, and participating as far as a movement goes. So if we think about something like a rally, a march, a protest, a demonstration, right? It's this idea that the movement itself is experiential, that being there, being at that space at that time is part of how the movement is working. We can think about this in some of the other movements we've talked about, for instance, Black Lives Matter and the occupation of the bridge. We can think about many of the rallies and demonstrations, the sense of camaraderie of being there and being active in that moment. And if that is experiential, if that's a part of the kind of oral, spoken, and embodied element of activism, then it holds a powerful influence on members of that group that goes beyond what were the signs saying or what was this movement doing to convince the US president. So I think that adds some additional context and light on a lot of these elements of the movement too. I wanted to share another video that I think highlights some of the discussion here about ways in which indigenous groups use communication strategies and protest strategies, and the ways that religious and spiritual and experiential living are shaping the ways that many of these movements are playing out.
Western religion basically like the tradition. And I think that's due because the Western tradition, God works in history, which is to say in events, but not in people and places. So what you end up with is capability of establishing the church of finding any place that's convenient to people. Let's train the earth as an object. And Indians don't believe it's an object. And they say, thousands of years of experience. The way you get irritated, it's another way. They were reconciled with European land when Christianity came and destroyed all their shrines and all detrimental things. Fortunately, they under Christianity so long, when they came over here, they did that to Indian shrines. And the idea being there is nothing spiritual. Everything is material and it's promulgated throughout science. So even in the social sciences, people don't stop and think best things, experience best things. No, immaterial. But religion and science and the rest are both wholly materialistic. And consequently, you then try and tell them, well, if you look at the earth, there are certain places that seem to have power. We don't know what kind of power it is, except you have a different feeling, you feel energized. And the question that certain folks is how do you approach that? Take something that's larger than yourself, create a vehicle whereby you can.
So, right, for a lot of kind of indigenous activists and people at the time, right, it's speaking about pushing back against other kind of religious or scientific approaches to conceiving of things such as land, such as property, such as territory, right, conceiving in a material context. And this idea of focusing on the immaterial or experiential or something that brings about an element of power or identity that exists outside of something that can be measured is in many ways sort of a driving force behind a lot of activism in this context. So I think what this reading and this kind of analysis of a lot of indigenous movements brings to the table are a lot of considerations. First of all, that when we're studying and looking at movements and how movements work, it's important for us to look at it in non-traditional and really kind of unique ways. So for instance, if we think about the idea that, Griffin's inception, crisis, consummation, well, it's not that easy, right? That oftentimes movements are not defined in terms of enacting a specific change or legislation, but in terms of generating support and experience among members of the group, right? The Red Power movement is in many ways characterized by being confrontational in its approach, but not necessarily being about convincing an outside audience as much as it is about reinforcing and shoring up the population effect. Who is the audience is an important consideration here, right? When we're looking at how movement communicates, we don't want to just focus on who we think the audience is versus the actual goals or aims. We'll talk a bit more on Wednesday about the idea of an enclave, but developing an internal alternative, right? A population of people connected together that can be supported and included in that process is a major strategy that movements use too, right? Of being involved, of participating, and finding community. And then lastly, the idea that through movements and through activism, it's the sense of developing and redeveloping culture through community, allowing people to work and collaborate with one another. So it can be strategic for culture to be developed through social change and through communicating about that change. So what I would like you to do now is take about 15 minutes or so and return to the groups that you worked with a little bit earlier to talk about how some of the indigenous tribes in our area, the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Wallowa Confederated tribes, have advocated or communicated about social change and strategies that have been used. So take some time to do a little bit of research and kind of understand some of the groups and issues that are happening in a more local capacity. And we'll talk about that together in just a little bit.
Motivation to advocate for conservation, discrimination, other motivations. Right. Essentially, one is to be
I don't think that was a lot. This
Other groups like some additional type here. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that came up for you all as you were doing some research into some of these groups and the ways that they communicate. So let's start here on this side. What were some of the things that you noticed about how some of these tribes have advocated for change and used strategies to do so?
Okay,
Thanks, Lena.
so a lot of it being kind of are giving back to the community, trying to give to the community,
Mhm.
and trying to keep them involved in offering a lot of events to get involved with. Like the one account, that we created. The organization was significant implications today for the. I don't remember what the first one is. Yeah. Okay. But today's stuff, that you told us about, voting and early voting on their Facebook. And I also, fought in tribal courts for fishing restriction activities and trying to get the right to hunt and fish and to gather, on their lands. And so basically just trying to keep the traditions alive that they have.
Yeah, so I think that the focus on kind of developing a sense of culture and community is something we really noticed through a lot of the kind of local forms of activism. But we also see things that connect to what we talked about last week in this alternation between more activist, protest-oriented forms, but also in engaging in tribal courts, in working to try to enable hunting and other activities. So there's a lot of kind of strategic building a community, but also working through some of the legal channels to help to make that happen. But here on this side, what were some things that you all noticed?
So there's a couple different companies that we took to advocate for social change within the competitive tracks of Utah. And that was in under environmental ways. And the first one that we talked about was the restoration for freshwater mussels.
Mhm.
And in another climate change vulnerability act, not act. It was a assessment done back in 2015.
Mhm.
And it was pretty good. And there were a bunch of research on it, and that basically just was for the environmental social change aspect. And also they advocate for social change in April for SAM, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month.
Mhm.
And the one thing that we found is that they have posters to submit artwork that kind of brought awareness to these factors. And for second and third prizes, they were rewarded for that.
Mhm.
And the third one we talked about was for resources. There was this program called PQ, and it was for people who move for positive change in the by bringing supplies to reservations.
Yeah. So these are excellent examples, right? And I think really get at how within a community, the goals, the strategies, the elements of the movement can look really different. So whether it is access to supplies and support that disproportionately impact the population, whether it's kind of pushing for legal or political change or representation, or as the other group brought up, right, the usage of groups and activism surrounding voting. There are a lot of different methods that we can continue to explore and look at that are really speaking to the ways in which groups are able to speak both toward developing a sense of consciousness and community, and also developing a strategy toward change as well. So I think one of the useful things for us to take away from this today is to be thinking about how movements work toward creating change internally, but also how movements create a sense of community and purpose and engagement among members. So something that you might think about for your Create a Movement presentation is to think about how you can engage in outreach and building a sense of community among members of that group as well. So to wrap up our discussion for today, we've talked about how a lot of movements and activism don't necessarily meet what we think as traditional audiences, right? It's not necessarily about convincing policymakers in power. It can be about a number of different strategies to create and maintain community, and are able to both develop an understanding of the issues and members of a group, and also be able to speak to and engage with those members. And what that means is we consider what makes a movement effective and how that communication works, right? Oftentimes we frame movements in terms of success or failure. Does Occupy Wall Street succeed or fail? Well, there's a lot of complexity and cultural difference that plays into how we can even look at and understand social change, right? There are whole brands of analysis, such as a feminist analysis of social movements that might look different. Next class, we'll look at the Chavez piece in discussing counterpublics and the ways that they shape communication. There is a Canvas prompt up for this week on Canvas. It'll be due on Sunday. And I will also be putting up the guidelines for the Create a Movement presentation for Wednesday's class. Please take some time to fill out that Google form on Canvas between now and Wednesday's meeting. I'll update you as soon as I have more information from ORA about what they're able to present. Please pass forward or email your group's work for the day. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and I'll see you again for Wednesday's class.